You are listening to Cemetery Confessions, the world's #1 goth talk podcast.
Hello and welcome back to Cemetery Confessions. The concerns of relevance, mortality, control, and ontology all roll themselves up into discussions of generations. On the one hand, you have a group of people working through the surreal and existential circumstance of becoming retro and classic, of being both valued for their knowledge and criticized for being passé or out of touch. While another group, on the other hand, grapples with a fight for legitimacy, for belonging, for stability, and for power. We are, all of us, in perpetual motion, never static, never immutable, yet looking for a sense of grounding, for meaning, for validation, and for control in a chaotic world. Some of us turn to Juvenoia, the critical eye directed at youth, grasping to find the blame for social change that feels alienating and to delegitimize the passions, goals, and experiences of young people. This reaction is nothing new. Ancient Egyptians complained about kids thinking they were right about everything. The Greeks complained that children were spoiled and had bad manners. In the 50s, we worried that comic books were corrupting children. In the 70s, we worried the typewriter was killing the written word, and so on and so on. Nothing is new, yet everything is new. Personally, I've lived long enough to see friends of mine who hated adults that dismissed their music and their hobbies in favor of their own archaic rules and preferences start complaining about how the kids these days are insert grievance here, right? I suppose you die a hero or live long enough to become the villain. It's a blossoming of hypocrisy, which preferences nostalgia, falling into a self-absorbed morosity of an imagined past that never really existed, while diminishing the lived experience of others right now. Hauntology rears its ugly head once again. Now, goth, in my experience, has a much higher degree of intergenerational mixing than other subcultures, and I wonder, in a world where millennials are chuggy and can't give up their crew socks and side parts, how do we collectively permeate that imagined generational boundary in the interest of subcultural cohesion? On this episode, we are going to explore the evolution of language, semiotics, sense-making, and technology. Are the differences between goths of various ages truly profound or overblown? Can somebody tell me what the fuck Skibbity Toilet is? I guess perhaps some questions will simply resonate throughout the universe, never receiving an answer. As always, I am your host, Danny Ashes, and I'm here with my co-host, Trey. Our guests this episode are Caroline of the band Corlyx and Kayla of the band Scum. So let's get started with introductions. Can you share with us when and how you were introduced to goth and what kind of sucked you into the scene?
I kind of have an interesting family dynamic. I have 3 siblings and we're all born in different decades technically. And my older brother, he was born in 87 and he was like one of the mall goth types. Like he was really into nu metal and wore a bunch of trip pants and stuff. And I really looked up to him when I was younger, so I always liked that sort of aesthetic. But I shouldn't say obviously, but he did not really listen to actual goth music. He was really about like nu metal and industrial. I mean, some stuff he listened to came close, but not really. I didn't get into actual goth music until much later. The first adjacent thing was when I was finally allowed on the internet at like age 13.
Mm-hmm.
I watched Charmed a lot when I was a kid because my mom really liked it, and I looked up the theme song and found the Smiths, so I started there, I guess. But I didn't get into like actual goth music until a couple years later. I used to watch Kaz Loves Bats when her name was Kaz Loves Bats, and she did YouTube, and she did one hair tutorial or something where she actually had a Tones on Tail song in the background. It was Christian Says. And I was like, oh, this is really good. So that was my actual jumping off point for goth music. And it's just kind of, I just kept listening since then. I don't know. Fantastic. I always had a goth adjacent, at least, aesthetic about me.
Yeah. Caitlyn, what about you? What was your introduction to goth?
Well, I'd say it was my mom. She was like a punk rocker kind of in the 80s, early 80s. She had like a purple mohawk. But like punk and goth were kind of twin flames in the early 80s. So she listened to some punk, but she also loved like all the Joy Division and The Cure, like all the kind of mainstream like 80s goth bands. And she always had that playing in the house. So even when I was like 5 years old, like I was listening to that. And it's just funny because when I started actually getting into it myself, I was like, oh, how do I know all these lyrics? Like, like I was just like, how do I know this song? And like, because actually she stopped being a goth, like right around when I was about 7 or 8 years old. She became like a crazy Christian.
Oh no.
And yeah, she like burned all of her CDs and LPs, and like she got rid of all her clothes, and like we were going to church 3-4 times a week. And then I was kind of like going along with it because, it's my mom. And then like right around 11, 12 years old, I started getting into industrial. That was definitely the first, because it was basically, early 90s. So it was like Nine Inch Nails, Marilyn Manson. Those were the mainstream. That was what I had access to. So it was like, oh, no, wait, I'm edgy. I'm an edgy preteen, 11 years old. Like that, this is what's cool to me because that is what was popular at the time. So, and I was also in Hawaii, so I didn't really have access to like any other things in the early 90s aside from what was on the mainstream, like what was on MTV. Basically, that was what you had access to.
Yeah.
And then, but it was primarily industrial, and like, this was before nu metal, I would say, like, or just like right before nu metal. And then a bunch of like Portland goths moved to Hawaii. And they started showing me bands like My Life in the Throco Cult and Christian Death and Susie. And that's when, but that was like, I was probably around 13 years old when that happened. And that was when like the full transformation occurred.
Right. That's interesting. Yeah, you both actually brought up the goth adjacent thing. Kayla, when you said that, it made me think about, for me, my reference points at the time were, I got into goth through metal, but the popular stuff was, like you said, Manson, Evanescence.
Yeah. I
liked the Birthday Massacre at the time, like early 2000s kind of thing. And I think a lot of people got into goth subculture through either industrial or punk or nu metal or gothic metal.
Yes.
And kind of poked around until you found the goth stuff. But that's kind of when I discovered this argument around, or this anxiety around non-goth bands being conflated with the subculture, and this thinking of like it was going to confuse people getting into the scene about what goth music was. So what you reminded me of was the other day I was reading an article that was mentioning artists like Caroline Carr and Playboi Carti and Pale Waves as like pseudo goth bands or part of goth music. And so those are like more contemporary versions of the like Marilyn Manson kind of thing. And I wonder if you if either of you had experiences with getting either shit from other people, or just your opinion now of like that association between general alternative bands with goth music.
I know. Okay, when I was younger, that is one thing that I will note, is that there has been sort of that conflation. I mean, my brother, he didn't consider himself like a quote mall goth, He knew it was new metal. He called it new metal, but he also thought that that's kind of like what goth was. I think that unless you like dive deep into the subculture itself, there is kind of like whatever's popular at the time, but it's somewhat more dark, just seems to get pigeonholed as goth for some reason. And I think it's been better in the last few years, but I do think that that's part of why people are like so adamant about the goth as a music-based subculture thing, in a way that a lot of other subcultures don't feel the need to be.
Yeah. It does make sense, because like I hadn't heard of Caroline Carr before, and I looked her up, and they have a very recognizable sort of goth look in their style, but the music is very clearly not goth.
Yeah, I have so much to say about this, but I want to like condense it as best as I can, so I'm not just like yapping.
Okay. Well, it is a podcast, so feel free to yap.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yapping is away. There is a huge difference between bands who use the goth aesthetic and make genres that have absolutely nothing to do with goth. Mm-hmm. And then there's also the level of bands who have a goth aesthetic, yes, and they also make dark music, yes, but it is not 80s goth music. So it's not death rock, it's not post-punk, it's not dark wave, it's not new wave. But it is the 90s version of what goth was to us kids in the 90s. So it's like each decade, the definition of what goth music is gets a genre or two gets added to that list. Yeah. As far as, what you want to call goth music. To me, if it's dark, if it's experimental, if it has a message, if it meets all three of those criterias and the members are also dressed as goths, that can be added to the list. I'm not going to be like, no, it must be what it was in the 80s and it must always stay what it was in the 80s. No, like, I'm sorry, but, for me, Skinny Puppy is industrial and they are goth. They are a goth band. Like, you can add that to the list. That happened in the 90s. And in the early 2000s, it just depends. I'm not going to say all industrial music is goth, because it certainly isn't. And there's certainly tons of members that don't even, that make industrial music that have nothing to do with goth. So it really is like a band to band basis. So whereas if you are making death rock, like, you're most certainly going to be a goth. Like, sure, there are genres that are like very, very pinpointed to the subculture, like, no question about it. But there's also, it just depends on the band. Like, I made an industrial record for my first album. That was not a goth record. Like, it was very industrial and dark, but it didn't really have, like, I never called it goth music ever. But then my second album, I was like, no, you know what? I always wanted to make a goth record. I'm going to make a goth record. We used all real bass, reverbed guitars. Like, I know what I'm doing. I've been producing music and writing songs for a very long time. So, it was intentful, where I was like, yeah, I'm going to make a goth record. And so, it just depends on a band to band basis. And I just think it's just like throwing these broad statements over entire music genres is where the arguments happen. You know what I mean? Right, it's like, oh, well, this isn't that. And like, you can give examples of like, because at the end of the day, we're critiquing music, and music is art. And it's like, there's so many different factors that come into play. And even like people want to talk about nu metal not being goth. Well, yeah, absolutely not. Korn is not goth. But let's look at Cold Chamber. I don't know. They've got some gothy songs, and they certainly were riding in the 90s. They were for sure riding the line of, what was goth or not. And they certainly got a lot of young goths interested in, but there's not a lot of examples of that, like Cold Chamber. And I don't know, even when I was a kid, like we all thought Kitty was goth as well, because they were like, but yeah, I mean, it was like the mistake of the 90s kids thinking that was goth, and then being like, oh wait, actually, like that maybe that's not exactly what it is. But at the end of the day, like when we're trying to put labels on art, this is why it just gets so argumentative, because we're trying to label art, and it can be a problem for sure.
Yeah.
But I just think, like, at the end of the day, you have to consider a lot of things. Like, you have to consider the way the band members dress. You have to consider their message. Are they writing? Is it indie rock? Like Johnny Goth is like this huge artist right now, and everyone's like, he's Johnny Goth. Of course he's goth, and he's making indie rock, man. And that's where I get a little bit pissed off, where I'm just like, come on, because it's like, you're taking our aesthetic and you're slapping it on indie rock music, which couldn't be more opposite than what the subculture is about. And that's where it just like kind of bothers me. On the other hand, there's like goth rap that's awesome, that's out right now. You know what I mean? Like, but they're doing it right. They're using like dark wave beats, and they're talking about really incredibly somber, stuff, and it's super dark and super vibey, very experimental, and like I dig it, and I'm literally not going to just sit here and be like, that's not goth because it has like a hip hop thing. Like, I would never, if they want to call it that, like, that's cool. But so I think it's just important to keep a little bit of an open mind about like what genres are we adding. And yet you can't really just like add a full genre to the list, because it really does depend on the band and the artist, what they're doing.
Yeah, there's always been a tension with artists, bands, the general music consuming populace, and the music industry, which is trying to sell a product. Between, the artists, some are just, they're creating art, right? They want to create a song, they want to create music that they like. It's not about being a goth album or a rap album or a country album. It's about, I want to play the music that I want to play. And then after the fact, that might get categorized as goth by industry or by fandom, stuff like that. That's where the tension between Andrew Eldritch and his classification comes from, or even to a lesser degree, Peter Murphy. A lot of those original quote unquote goth father bands, none of them are goth bands because it didn't exist at that point, right? It was something that was created as a descriptor of this group of bands that seem to have a cohesive sound, a cohesive aesthetic, a cohesive just ambiance with their music, their stage production, their all that together, and then also a fandom that grew up around it, and that became a cohesive whole, which then was labeled so it could be marketed to, on the cynical side of it. But also on the positive side, the labeling, as I've argued many times, is also very helpful when you're a new person coming into it and you're like, I like this band. What other bands can I look into that might give me the same vibe, the same thrill of excitement that this band gives me? And having a genre you can lean on helps. If you restrict yourself to that, you're going to miss a lot of great stuff. But it is a really good way of getting into something right off the bat. But then you do have, of course, after a genre's been established, you do have artists who will come in, like you said you did with that one album, Caitlyn, and you consciously are making an album specifically within some sort of genre, either as an exercise or just because it's fun. just it's interesting to you at the moment, and that's a different type of music, a different type of generation, and that's where you get some of the core, whether you want to call them first wave or second wave bands, are usually the bands that
Sure.
are actively wanting to fit in with this subculture, and so are creating a product that fits it. And that's great, but it's also something that I will regularly critique on this podcast when we're reviewing episodes, when I just say, oh, this band is just the exact same as this other band, and I'd rather just listen to this other band that I think is better. So that's always the danger when you're creating a genre exercise album, or you're trying to fit into a genre, is are you adding something to the genre? Are you showing your unique voice, or are you just kind of a covers band sort of shtick where you're doing the same thing as bands that already exist, which there's a place for that. It's not a place that I embrace. Other people do embrace it, and that's great.
Exactly. But a lot of these like definitions is what makes artists create these copy bands. Okay. Mm-hmm. Because they're like, well, it worked for that band. Like, I'm going to do that. Or like, I'm inspired by that, so I'm going to sound just like that. Mm-hmm. And so you have copy band after copy band after copy band getting success because fans, a lot of fans they love that. They eat it right up. Oh, you sound just like The Cure. Awesome. Whereas me personally, I couldn't live with myself if I sounded just like another band. Yeah. Like, I just wouldn't do music anymore because like I need to sound like me. Mm-hmm. And sometimes I'm going to be like, all right, I know I'm making this style record and I'm doing these two genres for this next record. And I always am intentional. But I'm not going to make like a record that sounds just like something else that's already out.
Right. And that's also the tension within a single band. One real quick thing, Danny, before you go. Within a single band, the exact same thing with fandoms and change. When a band moves on or is wanting to explore different sounds, that core fandom that fell in love because of one sound gets hugely up in arms. Your example of The Cure is good, sounding like The Cure. Well, which Cure? Right. The goth copy bands are sounding like Pornography era or Disintegration era Cure, not Wild Mood Swings era Cure.
Right. Exactly.
I wonder if from the social side of things, and Nemo, maybe you can speak to this a little bit, but like I didn't have access to the internet when I was 13. So through high school and a little after high school, it was more of it was a longer discovery process. So I would end up in spaces with other goths, with the either, band shirts or trip pants or just this general idea of what isn't a goth band that was misinformed. And I would get into these situations of sort of being made to feel like an idiot or like not belonging kind of thing. But now I wonder if it is a different situation because you can just sort of look that stuff up and get all of this information that I didn't have access to.
I think it is a little bit different now. When I was getting into this stuff, it was like 2013-ish, I would say 2012, 2013. And I think that there was still so much at that time of like people didn't, the same kind of overlap of people kind of had their own ideas of what goth was. So they just kind of projected it all. Yeah. When I was trying to get into stuff, I focused mainly on the aesthetic because I thought I had the music down from my brother. But at the time when I would search things up, I think the DIY stuff was pretty good. There was a website I used to go on called Cut Out and Keep, where I would go in the Gothic tags, and some of the stuff in there was very much actually like things you would see that were like stereotypically goth or whatever, and things that were not. But other than that, when I was actually trying to find music, the problem was at the time that I would go onto YouTube and watch subcultural YouTubers, and there weren't that many. There were like 3 that I saw at the time, which was Kaz Loves Bats, I think Sebastian Columbine, and Leah Mouse. Yep. Oh, and Dumpster Dolly. But the thing is, like, in that selection, not all of them had the same opinions, and not all of them were making content about what they thought goth was. The one that stuck out to me at that time, I think, was Leah Mouse, who was like, it's a life, it's a state of mind.
Yeah.
You know, it's so that was like my perception for a long time. But I do think that like that started changing in more like the mid 2010s. And when I've gone to goth nights and stuff here in like recent months, I've met, because I'm in Baltimore, there's a lot of college kids that come into like MICA in particular, which is a big art school. So like, you know, you have a lot of goth college kids coming in.
Yeah.
And when I've talked to them, a lot of them got into it like literally through TikTok. And the breed of TikTok goths that are on there now are completely different than, you know, what I was looking at as a teenager. So I think that for me, that kind of thing was still like, I had to figure a lot out on my own, and like getting into like different groups on social media and following certain things. And it was kind of a slow process for me. I do not think that that's the case now. I think that it is kind of beaten into you for hours a day if you doom scroll.
That's so interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, for me, when I was a kid, it was just all word of mouth and going to the club and seeing what the DJs were playing. It was pretty much, that's it. Like, friends would come over with CDs or tapes or whatever and be like, you got to check out this band. Like, that was it.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, that's what, you know, one of these questions I had was sort of wondering about that emotional experience of that, because thinking about that identity discovery process, I had this sort of prolonged sense of wonder and mysticism, because this process of searching out and discovering new music and new people, kind of figuring out the unwritten rules of the culture, and you know, getting this information about all these authors that died a long time ago or underground fashion, gave me this sense of kind of uncovering esoteric knowledge through this kind of I guess like an informal initiation kind of thing, that's trial and error, trying to emulate established goths. And I'm sure that is still part of the experience, but again, just sort of due to the quantity of content out there now and people sharing information, I wonder if that feeling of this is some hidden magical thing is shortened down to, you know, like a few weeks or months or something, or if that's still part of it.
Again, with me being like, I guess technically older Gen Z, and also having had a strict mother who did not let me on the internet until I was a teenager, I think I have a bit of a different experience than like a younger Gen Z would now. I had a lot of that like mystical discovery things, though I will admit too that a lot of that was through the internet. Like, I would stumble across things on like a less traversed blog post or something, and I would get super excited, like, oh my gosh, do other people know about this? And figuring out certain, like, I will also say too, when I was starting this stuff, there weren't that many like tutorials on how to do stuff compared to now. So like figuring out how, like, different ways to do my hair was always, you know, or things of that nature, figuring out how to cut up a shirt in just the right way. That kind of thing did give me that sort of sense. But I do feel that, like, yeah, at this point in time, like, there are things that I tried to figure out in recent years. There's a specific hairstyle I wanted to do a couple years ago that was like more in the mall goth aesthetic thing, because I went to see Korn and Evanescence. I wanted to fit the theme. And I figured it out through a tutorial, because I could find a tutorial for that hairstyle now, and I couldn't then. And it still was like, oh, cool, I figured out how to do it. But like, I don't think it hits as hard as like just figuring it out on your own after like looking at pictures or something.
Yeah, I mean, I think it just becomes a little more uniform when we're all online and like looking at what other people are doing online, rather than just like going to a concert or a club or a goth event and like seeing one person there and being like, oh my God, like you go up to them and you're like, I love your hair. And like, how did you do that? And just like, so then, I mean, we all do like grab from each other. If you look at pictures of like the Batcave, back in the 80s, it's like there was a lot more different styles, like people were not as uniform as they are now. But we also have all of the goth brands to blame for this as well, because they're all making the same kind of styled clothes and accessories and stuff. Like, I mean, I have stuff in my wardrobe that, thousands of other goths have, but like we all like it because it's cute and we love it. But like, yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting to at least observe now. And I do see some people like complaining about this, but I'm like, it's just, we are a product of our environment, and like we all have access to this media and social media that we're all kind of like, oh, we like that. So then we all do it. And it's for me personally, I've tried to take a step back from like your typical goth aesthetic, and I've tried to incorporate more of my own personal touches to everything, like even more so now, because I noticed it becoming more and more uniform over the years, especially now. Like it's very popular. It's super trendy. I mean, I don't know if you guys see it, but it's incredibly trendy.
Yeah, we're going to talk about that. Yeah.
Yeah. So I've just been like, all right, you know what? Like, I actually have no problem with it. I'm not going to be like, oh, they're appropriating me. But like, I'm just going to be like, okay, cool. I love it. Everyone's going goth. Same thing happened in the 90s. It actually did happen. The Tim Burton thing, and everyone was like obsessed. I mean, how could you not turn goth in the 90s? We had The Crow, we had Tim Burton, we had all of the bands, we had, all of this dark stuff going on. So, like I'm cool with it, but it makes me want to sort of carve out my own individual style even more.
Yeah, it's interesting you said that too, because I have a specific memory of going to a club and seeing this one person there that had a completely different hairstyle from everyone else that I thought was just like, it blew my mind. I was like, holy fuck, this person looks incredible. I have to do my hair like that. And then through that process of trying to figure out how to do that on my own with just the memory of that interaction, the sort of entropic trial and error of that created my own kind of unique stamp on what the other person was doing, rather than just sort of this like, okay, well, I'm going to do this step-by-step tutorial that I can watch on YouTube. And I guess not to say, like, you could still use a tutorial and say, well, I'm going to do this a little different, or my face is shaped like this, so I'm I'm kind of two minds, because I do think some older goths try to gatekeep information to a degree, because that initial experience was so meaningful in a way that really created this impact on your life of like, this is who I am as a person. That kind of slow burn of unraveling all the layers of complexity around goth culture. But I can also, that was my microphone, not my I didn't just fart. And sorry about the noises.
Okay.
I can acknowledge that as important as that was for me, it doesn't necessarily have to be everyone's experience. And I don't think if someone's experience is different, it's necessarily inferior.
No,
it's just
absolutely
different.
not.
But I think some people do think that.
So as far as, I guess from my perspective, because I have a perspective that I went through kind of all of the phases of discovery, or all the methods of discovery since I started, and I didn't get into goth until later in life. And it was in the mid-90s, but I got it because of a recommendation from another person, because I found, the gatekeeper, or not the gatekeeper, the gateway bands, like we already talked about in the 90s. So I got in through Nine Inch Nails and Typo Negative, because those were available and I was hearing them, mostly Nine Inch Nails on the radio in the mid-90s. So that was the main thing that really dragged me in. And then a friend, when finding out that I liked those bands, said, oh, here's some additional things to look into. And that's how I discovered goth was even a thing. I didn't know it at all. I had the touchstones of it or the elements of it that I was familiar with because I watched MTV throughout the entire 80s. So I definitely watched some stuff that was goth, but it was in and amongst all of the other music videos that I loved on MTV in the 80s. So I didn't really classify, oh, I really love these bands, let me look into them. It was like, oh no, I liked all of this music at the time. And I liked your things that are not part of the goth canon because they're beforehand, but your Addams Families and your Munsters and stuff like that feeds the aesthetic, but aren't really part of it because they predated it. So I had all of this stuff as sort of a prepping myself to.
You don't go to the goth club dressed like Uncle Fester or something, but you might incorporate that in some way. Yeah, but I might do Morticia. Well, that's true. Yeah. That's true. Yeah.
So, or even Gomez. But no, Fester's more of a rivet head.
I think it's just like if you're a kid and you're drawn to these dark images and like, somber music and like, it's like, I don't know when the moment was, but I was always drawn to it. I always loved it. Like anything horror or like I loved spiders. I loved reptiles. Like, I was just always drawn to that stuff.
Yeah.
And I think it's like it just like you build and it builds and it builds and it builds. And you're like, oh, I guess I'm a little bit different.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, after I got introduced by actual recommendations from a person, which was the time, then all of my initial research was going to record stores with listening stations, looking for compilation albums, because this was really prior to me jumping on the internet, because the internet was just in its infancy at that point. And I was just getting into it because I just went off to college, and college had fast internet connections at the time where home was all dial-up, slow, useless connections that didn't really get on the internet as we know it right now. So it was a lot of that sort of thing, which was useful, but it was limited because, you're going to comps and you're just looking at artists from a single label. I did not get so deep into, like, I never discovered the tape trading scene. The zine scene I was a later discovery on that. Never really got into mail order catalog stuff either. So I kind of limited that sort of thing. It was basically just record stores and then researching if I could find on the nascent internet what are good specialty record stores in the area. Finding a record store that specialized in alternative, underground, goth, punk, whatever music, which did exist back then, not so much now. So that was sort of my initial, and then getting into the early internet, getting into Usenet, alt gothic, stuff like that, learning more things about that back when the internet was small and not quite as congested with just information overload. So the stuff you found there was a little bit more, in my opinion, high quality, though not as extensive as you can find now. It was still harder to find underground things, but the information you did find, if it mentioned a relationship with this band with goth, tended to be more accurate. So what I'm seeing now is we've passed an inflection point. Like Danny said, we're talking about this discovery series, this mystery, this unearthing of secrets. Admittedly, as I expressed way back when in our Has Goth Lost Its Sense of Mystery episode years ago.
Oh, yeah.
That was never an important part for me. And I just found it frustrating that I couldn't find the information. And the fact that I can find it much more easily now is, I consider, a great benefit. But I'm also coming at it from a perspective of someone who already has the majority of the core information just from being involved in it for so long, that it's easier for me to look at the vast amounts and just use that as an addition rather than as the sort of revelatory discovery sense of figuring out my identity through this searching process. But as far as I was saying with the inflection point is, like I said, when I first was getting into it, the information I found was sparse but true. the problem now is we hit an inflection point where we just got more and more information. It was more and more valuable until you hit this point where you keep getting more information, but it makes it harder to find the good information, because what you see now is a lot of information about goth, and not all of it is actually about goth. It's being labeled as that because of SEO, because of clickbait, because of misinformation, whatever. There's many, many reasons that things are being labeled.
It's trendy. It's trendy on all fronts. On all fronts.
Yeah. And that's a double-edged blade. It's great that it's trendy because you can find stuff. It's easier to find stuff that matches an aesthetic. It's easier to find music that might match that aesthetic, but only if you already know what you're looking for. The other side of it, there's tons of people who are classifying things as goth because it's trendy and they get the click through, even though it has little to nothing to do with it. And that makes it infinitely harder for someone just getting into it who doesn't have that basis of knowledge to be able to look at it with a critical eye and say, this is being called goth, but it's not because of this, or this. Or this is close to goth and it has these touchstones and it relates to these things from the history, and I can put it into a sort of a musicological or aesthetic history of subculture framework, versus someone without that foundation just being overwhelmed and then running into awkward situations when they claim something is goth to a person who had a different framework, and then they have these debates and arguments about what is and is not, and it becomes a huge problem.
There's clear violations, and then there's ones that are riding the line of, well, I guess you could see that, but there's definitely so many, way more instances now of really just like, no, you're really just, now you're just pissing us off.
Yeah, and it's those gray areas that I think are where the interesting stuff is happening.
Yes.
Because the stuff that's cut and dried, it's obviously goth. That's the stuff that's almost always just retreading the stuff that's already been done, or it's just explaining the stuff. It's someone talking about their experience in the 80s or the 90s, which is great, and it's good to see that historical standpoint, but that's not evolving the scene, evolving the subculture. It's not introducing anything new. Those gray areas, though, where someone they're not goth, but there's something about them that sort of plucks the same string as the goth vibe does. That's where you get growth and expansion, and that's where I find my most interesting discoveries, and where my passion lies, is sort of delving into the mysteries of that gray area of goth versus not goth.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think an aspect to this that I want to ask about is because Trey, you were talking about how once there's so much information being put out there, you don't know what's good or bad. And what that made me think of is the experience of sort of being involved in a local scene, and everybody kind of knows, like, oh yeah, this person's full of shit, or this person thinks that they're God's gift to goth or whatever. And for me at a young age, the importance of getting approval and guidance from older goths. So I wanted to ask Nemo first, I guess, if that was important to you, if it was more like those older goths are full of shit and I don't care, or it was just like more stuff was online, so it wasn't relevant. Like, did you have a relationship with that?
It kind of both for me. I would say at the time that I started going to shows, that approval was super important to me. But I don't think it was just because, I don't even think it was that I wanted to, that I cared about the approval of older goths at the time. I think I just initially had wanted anyone around me to be into the same stuff as me, because when I started getting really into it, like, it's true, it seems to be a trend now. I have a lot of friends who were my friends before through like cosplay or like the punk scene or other things, who have gone really hard into goth stuff, but that wasn't the case at the time. I was kind of like the only one in my friend group. So I did go to events like wanting approval, and so I was always just very excited when someone who had clearly been around was speaking to me. I will say there was a local guy who is much older. He claims that he was like had lived in England in part of the 80s and like went to the Batcave and all that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And I did vie for his approval for a while. I had a friend who is older than me but much younger than him, named Amy, who used to hang around him, and neither of us talk to him anymore, because I think that that's part of why I don't usually go for the approval, I guess, elder goths anymore, because even though he had some interesting stories about the scene in the past, he was just kind of creepy in the end, you know.
Yeah.
And after that, I was just like, you know, it doesn't really matter. Like, I can do my own thing, it's fine. But I feel like that's also kind of like, I don't know if that's like a unique experience or not, you know.
It's definitely not unique.
No.
It's the danger of subcultural capital. It's leveraged by some people as a means to an end, which is usually manipulative.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I started getting snuck into the castle. I left Hawaii at 15 years old and I moved to Tampa, or Sarasota, which is like right under Tampa.
Mm-hmm.
And I hooked up with all the Tampa goths. And they started sneaking me into the castle when I was 15, 16 years old. And so I was hanging out with people in their 30s, thinking I was so cool. But like, little did I know, I was getting groomed by a few of them.
Yeah, it was exciting to me at the time, just because like I was really getting into like, I don't know, kind of like the historical element or like the trad goth stuff, since I had been exposed to things that were, like I said, like mid to late 90s and later. So like going back, it was really exciting to meet someone who like was in his 50s or whatever at the time, but I was like 19. Like I was an adult. He was like a 50-something-year-old dude, and I was like 19. And I remember not wanting him and the people he was around to even know that I was like that young, because it was at an event that was like 18 plus. So I was like, surely I can pass as old enough to drink. But now looking back, I don't think he cared. I don't think he cared at all.
Yeah. It's unfortunate, obviously. Like there's just like, my first boyfriend, actually, he was a goth, and I was 17 and he was like 19 or whatever. It was Florida, so you know, there you go. And he was just like, he like told me like, the only reason why I dress like this is to get girls.
Cool. Cool guy.
And I was like,
crazy to admit that to you.
Okay. And I was like, well, I guess it worked.
Yeah.
I dumped him probably a few weeks after that, but yeah.
It's interesting. I had kind of two different experiences with that, and very much I think this was out of just the privilege of being male presenting. The only real negative experience in that vein I had was when I was getting into emo when I was like 19 and 20. And the emo kids I would hang out with, like on, you know, in the downtown area, there was this one guy who I thought was like super cool because he knew a bunch of stuff and he knew everybody and he was outgoing and everything. And then at one point I talked to one of the girls I knew, and she was like, you know, he's actually like 32 and kind of creepy, so maybe like don't hang out with him. He won't leave us alone. He just kind of hangs around. And that was my first realization of like, oh, there's people abusing their knowledge to be shitty. But on the other hand, like with the goth stuff, I didn't have a great relationship with my parents. And so I was kind of looking for that like fairy goth mother, goth parent kind of thing where there was somebody older than me and wiser than me that was into the things that I was interested in and could teach me about music they listened to, how to do my makeup, how to interact and navigate social situations. And there were a few different people that I looked up to that I would kind of emulate. Like, I learned if you light your clove off of a candelabra, that's very romantic and sexy. But like, stuff like that. And so that was, for me, was a good experience. And I think it's just something where you can kind of replace that with internet tutorials and things like that, but the sort of, and it doesn't have to be somebody older, I guess, but that sort of like specialized knowledge specific to your local community, you can't really get online. I know there's videos about like how to interact in a club environment and that kind of thing, podcasts like this, whatever, but the personal experience of sitting in somebody's house and talking with them, or being taken to a club by somebody who is established in the scene and isn't a creep, is a kind of unique experience. But I can also see how that like surrogate family thing can also be exploited. So I like to think it's not as much in goth, and that's more of a valued experience. But yeah, I guess it goes both ways.
What I want to say about that is like it can happen in any like friend group or any social, like there's lots of, it doesn't matter if we're talking about, goth or any subculture. It can happen even in like the sports guys and the cheerleader girls, like they, or whatever. But I think like I've had more positive experiences with elder goths than negative as a whole. And a lot of it was like, maybe friends with my mom, or a lot of Gen Xers who I was friends with were awesome. And they weren't that much older than me, but they really kind of like became like my family. Absolutely. And I would say as a whole, overall, and I've been all over the world as well, lived in a lot of different countries and cities. So I've always had to make new friends. And I would say I've had way more positive kind of like family bonding experiences with goths than like negative predatory experiences.
Yeah, and about the whole, it happens in goth too. I mean, yes, it's true. There are actual goths who are also abusers, but there's also, like I think you were saying, Caitlyn, about that one boyfriend.
Yeah,
they weren't even really goth. They were just putting on a goth costume to get a girl of a certain aesthetic, because they have some preconceptions about what that means for them, what they can get from that interaction. So it is a target for people who are outside of the scene. The whole big titty goth girl trend is an example of that too. Just the popularization or the fetishization of gothic bodies means that people outside of the subculture then have an aspiration to acquire one of those for their own purposes. So even if the goth scene itself was perfectly healthy, women in the goth scene particularly, but yeah, women in the goth scene are not necessarily safe, because there are people from outside the scene who still can come in and leverage the knowledge of the aesthetic, or the knowledge or superficial knowledge that you can glean from the internet, to manipulate people who are just getting into the scene, which also conveniently usually dovetails with people who are barely legal as well, which is also a fetishized aesthetic. So
I mean, I made a whole TikTok about this, and it's basically the word poser, in my opinion, should only be saved for those people. Yeah, literally people who are there pretending to be goth so they can get girls. You know?
The poser that's like, manipulative rather than just a confused person just getting into the scene or just experimenting in the scene. Just they don't know what they want, but they're like, well, let me try this. Let's see if this fits, and that's cool. That's fine.
Yeah.
There are people who, in a less toxic way, I might call posers. I guess we can get into this, but the like, I've known people who are fresh goths and they are in the scene for a month or two and have this big ego and start trying to force everyone to think about, or to think goth, and the way you are a goth is in this very specific, narrow definition that they have, and they're like, oh, I read about this thing and that thing, and you're an idiot because you know those people are insufferable.
The Dunning-Kruger goth.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. I had a girl comment on some post. I forgot what it was, but she was like, "You must be new to goth," and I was like, "Honey, why don't you just Google my name?"
Yeah. Yeah.
The other thing I wanted to mention, sort of dovetailing on your new to goth thing, is Danny made a distinction with the older younger when we were talking about elder goths, and they don't actually need to be older. I think there does need to be a distinction made between chronological age and subcultural age.
Yeah.
Yes.
So there are definitely people who could be young but got into goth when they were toddlers.
Yeah.
Versus someone who's in their 50s and just discovered it 5 years ago.
Sure.
Yeah, I'm not a fan of the I just turned 40, I'm an elder goth now. Like, I guess that's a different way to think, because like, okay, you're older, but that in this subculture, that's not what it means to me is age. It's more like participation and
right.
Yeah.
That's always been my thing. You know, I would consider myself an elder goth only because, you know, I could say I've been involved in the subculture since the mid 90s.
Yeah.
Yeah. Exactly.
Rather than
Same here.
I happen to be in my mid 40s. That has nothing to do with it. But yeah, it's how long you've been involved actively within the subculture and engaging with the subculture, because you're not really learning anything if you're not really engaging with it at the same time.
Well, since we're here, let me ask about, I'll just in general, Kayla, if you want to grab this one first, this sort of like, what is your view of the role and I guess practical use of gatekeeping and or like the word poser and that kind of thing?
I have not seen that many people use the term poser unironically in the last couple of years. I've seen it used as like a joke on TikTok. I have seen a lot of people gatekeeping, and I feel like there has been like a lot of conversation around gatekeeping, and I think that it's kind of a mixed bag. I think that there's some aspects in which it's necessary, and some aspects in which it is very much not. I think that how do I put this? A lot of the current trends around goth stuff is the stuff that you see on TikTok, and I find that the way that those largely teenagers interact on there concerning the subject is interesting, because they seem to really, really, really care about very specific things and not others. So in some contexts, I think that something like, for instance, we were talking about earlier, like gatekeeping against predators who are just kind of like wearing it as a costume to get access to women, vulnerable women, girls, that is where gatekeeping is a good idea. But I've also seen people at each other's throats for like not using white foundation as a base for their makeup, and they're like, that's necessary to try goth makeup, and I'm like, since when? I don't understand. So I think that gatekeeping has a place. I do think that the current iteration of the goth subculture, at least among younger people, is not doing it exactly the way that I would do it. But
no, that's interesting too, because I do, at least in my experience as a younger person, I think when you are younger, you tend to be more black and white thinking. Somebody on Facebook was posting all these screenshots from TikTok where different people were saying, well, you know, goth is anti-fast fashion, and so you should only ever DIY and buy from thrift stores, and if you buy from Shein or something, you're not really goth. And then people in the comments saying, well, you know, I'm poor, or I'm disabled, or I don't have access to a thrift store or whatever, so this is just this is where I get my stuff. And then, you know, them coming back and saying like, oh, I guess you don't understand how goth is anti-capitalist, and just sort of that like baby leftist view that's like trying to do the right thing, but really not understanding the nuance of the world they live in, I think that's kind of just what you have to go through to like figure your stuff out.
Yeah, that reminded me of a video I just watched that had zero to do with goth, but it has
then
a
don't
lot
bring it
to
up.
do.
What are you doing?
I'm going to bring it up anyways. 'Cause I'm playing the co-host card. But it's about that idea of young people being very literal in their understanding of something.
Mm-hmm.
So the video is called Fascism and the Failure of Imagination.
Okay.
And a part of it, they were talking about how people evolve in their understanding of a social dynamic. They were using games as a specific example, how people learn games and develop in their understanding of it. And they kind of viewed it as 3 phases you would go through. The beginning phase, you're very young, but you're very imaginative and creative. And the game is just sort of barely a means to an end. You disregard rules and you're just playing it whatever you want. You're doing the Calvin ball idea for those who understand Calvin and Hobbes of how to play a game. It's, or just the general let's pretend that kids do. You suddenly, I have this extra ability. Oh, you put this in? Well, now I invent this other thing and it counters your thing. And it's this constant reimagining of the environment. But then as you get a little bit older, you're still young, you learn these rules and those rules become carved in stone. They become, this is how you do the thing. And you have to do it this way or you're doing it wrong.
Yeah.
And that's sort of the phase 2 development of understanding the dynamic of the environment. And in theory, you want to get past that to be almost sort of a happy medium where you understand the rules as a framework, but not the end all be all of the interaction. There's a larger goal of the interaction, and sometimes the rules facilitate that, and sometimes the rules hinder that. And you have to be able to navigate that, but that takes a much more internalized idea of the rules as they are laid out before you can really start playing with them.
Right.
And one of the base examples I have for that is you look at people when they talk about language, rules of language. The people who get really up in arms about people using words wrong and using language wrong because of some understanding that they developed from schooling or about, no, this always has to be this way. But then you get into the people who are the artists, the creatives, your Shakespeare inventing words, your Dr. Seuss making things up, all these great artists are playing with words and inventing new words in ways that serves the function of words in that they're expressing the idea. They're getting an idea across. They're communicating, but they're using something that isn't a word. And for a pedant, they're just going to be like, that's not a word. You're not making any sense. But the follow-up question is, well, do you understand what they mean? If yes, then it is a word. It served its function as a word. And that sort of idea is, I think, sort of the evolution of social dynamics and how to interact with that environment. And yeah, I think we're talking about that sort of hosiery gatekeeper is stuck in that middle area where they have a very rigid understanding of whatever they're focused on, whether it's the music or the fashion or just the subcultural norms. They have this hard and fast carved in stone rule, which is from their upbringing, from who they learned from. And they're still in that phase where that is so important that it must be defended against all comers. And they're not at a phase where they can be a little bit more flexible in that again.
Well, yeah, it's definitely an age thing. But some people never graduate to the 3rd level, right? Like they're in like a trauma response in like a circle of like, and that they're probably like that with a lot of other things in their life as well. I mean, and I'm actually, I have empathy for that. Once I see that behavior, I'm like, oh, okay, you are not evolved and you are stuck. Like, I'm just going to leave it at that. But I also really empathize with the amount of information, especially like Gen Alpha and Gen Z are exposed to. Like they want to feel like that they love these labels and kind of sticking to these like cult like things in a way because they're just exposed to so much. I couldn't imagine what that feels like, especially growing up and trying to find an identity and like, who am I, when they have so much information constantly coming into their brains. And it is kind of like maybe a safe place for them to be like, I'm this, I'm goth, and so I do this, you know, and maybe that just feels a little bit better than being like, well, whatever, you know, it's easy for me to be like, well, I could do anything. One day I'm going to dress like this. One day I'm going to be this. Now I'm going to listen to hip hop. Now I'm going to listen to goth. Now I'm going to, you know, it's easy for me to do that because I have a very secure sense of who I am.
Yes.
And my identity. And I'm also an older woman, but like, you know, I kind of grew up in a very much more simpler time. We really did. And like, you know, when new music came out, it was like, this is grunge and this is new metal. And today it's like just a rehashing, a recycling of every single thing. And so many different trends are on trend. And like, there's so many things being fired off at once. It just depends what algorithm you're in, you know, that like tells you how to think and what to buy and who you are. And I think, you know, I would be reacting the same way. I would be like, no, I need to just pick a thing and that's me, you know, and at least that would give me some sense of belonging and comfort because I really I can't imagine what it feels like growing up like that. And I just feel like, you know, if you're even an older millennial, like we had things were very simple. And it was just like, this is the new grunge band. And like, there's 3 of them. And you were like, yeah, I like that. Okay, today I'm going to rip holes in my jeans, you know? And then we got into the next thing and it was very easy to just like identify where you belonged and like kind of who you were. And today, oh my goodness, it's just like a mess of so many different things going on at once. And you're scrolling and you're being exposed to so many different things. It's like, yeah, I can imagine wanting to just be like, fuck this. Like, I'm this and that's how it's got to be.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've also been watching a few videos about the death of genre and whether that's a good or a bad thing. And most of them that I can agree with are falling on the side of it's a good thing. With usually asterisks, but yeah, the idea that there used to be these very rigid subcultures and genres that you could just sort of join. It's more of a club or a gang rather than this very free for all world where you have so many options and I guess that's the whole concept of the spectrum. It's freeing on one hand, and that's great. But it's also very, very difficult to find a footing on a spectrum when you're trying to figure out who the hell you are.
Exactly.
And so it means they have less of a foundation. Kids growing up these days have less to base that sort of foundation on and then build on. They're trying to build on a mudslide, basically.
Exactly. Yeah.
Any thoughts on that, Kayla? On the old people complaining about the internet?
No, I complain about the internet as well. I have a little bit of a unique view in that I work as a substitute teacher, so I deal with a lot of Gen Alpha kids, predominantly middle school. And
I'm sorry.
I thank you. I'm very, very concerned for them. I think that they've got a lot of behavioral issues and a lot of attention span issues. And they really do, for every little thing, because there is so much out there, create a strict set of rules to classify things with. So they don't, there is a lot more of a spectrum thing, but they seem to just go through phases really rapidly. And also while they're in that phase, follow a really strict set of rules, which again, bringing it back to TikTok, I think becomes obvious when you look at any of the younger TikTok creators. They're like, this is how you do the look. You have to think this way. These are the bands you listen to, and if you don't, we will bully you. It's kind of like that with everything, though. It's certainly not limited to goth. I don't think that's a fault of the goth subculture. But I will say that working in middle schools in particular has given me a lot of insight as to why kids are this way. There was an incident a couple weeks ago. It was a particularly rough class too, but I had a student who had his phone out. He wasn't supposed to have his phone out. I honestly, I don't even know why they feel the need to do that. In addition to having their county mandated Chromebooks,
Yeah, Chromebook.
they all have computers.
Yeah.
But he stops me and he was like, "Oh my gosh, did you see this?" And then he shows me a video of a woman being shot, not too terribly far from where we were. And I was just like, I don't know, I had a moment there where I was like, oh, like when I was in middle school, we were all excited to like say curse words and hope that the teacher didn't hear. But these kids are going to school and watching people die.
Yeah.
Like,
Wow.
that's just like normal to them. They're just like, oh, did you see this? That did not happen to me when I was younger. It definitely didn't happen to people older than me, because at least when I was younger, you could go home and get on best score if you were one of those kids, you know? But like, that is just like part of their reality, is that they constantly have media in their face. There's an algorithm and they're exposed to just like straight up traumatizing material. You know, that's not even like TV show gore. That was just a real life loss, you know?
Yeah.
So, I mean, it makes sense to want to fit into certain things where there's rules and stuff, because I think it gives you a sense of community and it kind of grounds you.
Exactly.
Like really, they're just all over the place. I'm scared.
Yeah, I mean, I like, because I have an 11-year-old and I really try to. There's limits on his phone and computer and what he can access and how long he can access for, and I think he's pretty well adjusted, and he does have there's encouraging stuff, like a lot of his friend group are queer and talking about gender and those kinds of things, but obviously there's only so much control I have, and you can't control a kid completely anyway. That would be a bad idea. So I think in those instances it's like there's an issue with the parents, but you kind of have to just do your best to instill values and not be a shithead to your kids, so then when they're out in the real world they kind of make better decisions. But there is so much more and like to access to like extreme porn and stuff like that. I can't even imagine.
Oh yeah, I've had a lot of issues with kids like that in class. Wasn't the same class, but it was the same school, same day, I think. It was 7th grade that I was teaching, and I confiscated a note on accident. I thought, because I was in art class, I thought it was just like they had scribbled something to start their project, and it was like a really graphic note about me and stuff that was like, oh, I bet this teacher has OnlyFans, doesn't she? Yeah, like my hair's purple, so I guess I look a little weird. And I was just like, this is like, you guys aren't even teenagers yet. Like
Well, to be fair, in the 80s, Van Halen had Hot for Teacher too, so it's hardly a new thing.
Yeah, that's true. I think the best we can do, and as parents, I don't have children of my own, but I have lots of friends with kids, and it's just like, you just got to be the best example, be the example. That's really all you can do.
Yeah, and not invite friends over who suggest age-inappropriate cartoons in front of their child.
Yeah.
That's sort of an inside joke, because that was me.
Yeah.
I'll be like, well,
I'll have a conversation with you about that later, Trey, and how you should act around my child.
Yeah, I know. I need that.
No, well, we're kind of getting off topic, so let me try and wrangle this back into something.
Back to goth.
I guess sort of related to that was just the question around, when you think about what goth is, or the beliefs or ideologies that you associate with goth, if you think there is a overall group of ideologies or anything like that. Like we talked about, I mentioned the anti-capitalist thing or being queer, or do you think there's more of a like goth is purposefully apolitical? What do you think what's your experience with that overall?
For me, I've kind of had my opinion change a couple of times throughout the years. I think that, I know that in interacting with people my age or younger, that there is this idea that like goth came out of punk, and punk was political, so therefore goth has this set of politics as well.
Yeah.
But also, though, something that's interesting to me is that like the set of politics that are attached to it now are kind of not the ones that were those, back in the day either.
Yeah.
So I find it interesting. I think that there are a certain set. It's hard to say. I think that in terms of fitting into the subculture, as far as like being a part of the scene goes, there is a certain ideological, a broad ideological thing that you have to kind of fit into. I don't think it's as stringent as people say. I don't think you have to be as far leftist as like I am, but I think that like very basic like anti-racist stuff, for instance, is pretty key. I think that anti-capitalism is tied to it, but I don't think that like, how do I put this? I especially because I'm like part of the punk scene as well. I see this exact same thing happening there, where people will be like, you can't be this if you hold these beliefs. But back in the day, that was not the attitude. They still like were like, oh, these people are part of it. We just think that they suck. Like, you know, the Nazi punks fuck off things. They didn't say that the Nazis weren't punk. They called them Nazi punk. They were just like, we hate them. We should kick them.
Yeah.
So I do not think that, I think that it is obviously the common belief that there's a very specific set of ideology that you have to be, but I don't think that you really do have to be. I think that, especially since the attitude, the common thing that is said so much is that goth is a music-based subculture. I really do think that that's all you need, but I also think that in order to participate, I think that in order to participate in the scene, though, I think that there begs like a certain level of just casual understanding of certain ideological things there.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, goth is gay and it will always be gay. I mean, like, you know, the queer community. It's exactly. I'm kind of joking here, but
you are.
Yeah, it's just like, you know, you can't go to any goth space and be anti-queer or homophobic. Like, just hands down, you will not belong there. And it's still so wild to me that it even exists. And I'm just like, I guess I've seen it more in Germany than anything. And I've actually been to events in Germany where girls have like swastikas like on their nipples. And like just out walking around with swastika titty tassels. And I'm like, really? Like we're okay with this here?
Yeah.
Actually, really interesting.
Sorry, I thought that was like actually illegal in Germany.
Yeah, I was going to say that's the same.
There's a whole thing about
really I've seen it. That stuff.
Oh, I know, and but it's there, and I have actually at a Nine Inch Nails concert, I like rescued this girl. She was like getting harassed by like these Nazi goths at freaking Nine Inch Nails concert because she was black, and we actually had to like almost fight off. Yeah, we like literally we saved her life. Like we rushed her out of the venue. We gave her a ride back to her place. Like I can't tell you how many I've only experienced stuff like this in Germany. So also actually once at a London event, Torture Garden, I also saw swastika nipple tassel lady, and maybe she's the same lady. I don't know, but she goes to all these events.
I feel like those have to be custom made. I feel like that's not something that you just go on Temu and find.
No, absolutely not. For sure, custom made. But you know, like I'm just like, I guess I don't know. Maybe Europe is just like a little more behind. You know, there's some really like still messed up shit that goes down here. There's a lot of like way more than the US, and I wish like American goths understood like the differences. And once I really started like living in these countries, I really started getting exposed to like, oh, actually America is like not as bad as I thought it was, because this shit is scary. Okay. And I mean, I'm in Italy right now, and it's like a completely far right government. Like it's terrifying. Like people just like literally have no rights, and like I can't go out to certain places dressed up. Like I absolutely cannot, because I'm putting my safety at risk. Like I just even being a goth in public in certain places in Italy. So like, you know, I think it's basically just like it's always been a safe space for marginalized people. And I know the definition of like left has changed over the years.
Yeah.
For sure. Like I do empathize with older lefties who are like, well, wait a minute, that's not what I thought when I became, a leftist. And it's just like, yes, okay, things are changing. You need to either adapt or, and a lot of them, I've had a lot of my fellow lefties like turn because they can't accept the changes that are happening.
Yeah.
And they get all like disgruntled about it. And then all of a sudden I'm like seeing them, but they're also getting exposed to a lot of this like, right-wing conspiracy theory algorithms, and it starts to warp their brain. Okay. And they start like thinking all this stuff is going on, all these things are going on when they're just not. And I'm like, you guys are getting brain rot from algorithms. And it's sad to see. It's definitely sad to see, but I also understand how it happens. And I know that like in their hearts, they are good people and they just kind of like got brainwashed by these like horrible things that are going on in these algorithms. And they really just didn't stand a chance against it, honestly. And I think it's just like really good to constantly put yourself in check and like, make sure what you're absorbing through your freaking screen isn't rotting your brain. And just like deplug for a while. But yeah, I mean, like goth it's a safe space. Like we don't have to sit here and be like, it's political movement. Get out on the street and protest. If you're not a person who's a fighter and a protester, like that's okay. But you have to also accept the fact that goth spaces are safe spaces for marginalized people. Yeah. Like period, hands down.
Well, a couple of things. I can't remember the specifics, but I did see a couple blog posts from Germans talking about the fascism problem at WGT, which I won't really talk about because I can't remember exactly what was going on, but that is a thing I've heard about.
Yes.
And Kayla, to your point, there was something interesting you said about referencing, because I see this a lot, this sort of like reference back to goth came out of punk, and punk had these set of political ideals. I do see a lot of younger people appealing to a historical precedent as a means to like legitimize their opinion, which makes sense. Like I get why. But I am generally more of the mind of like, it's good to know about history, but also don't necessarily let that determine how we respond now and looking at what the social situation is in our current environment. I read an interview with a DJ in Arizona. I don't remember who they were, but they said something like their scene is really fierce because of the political climate, and a lot of them are fighting for abortion rights and stuff. And then I also just saw an interview with Serge Tankian where he basically said that it doesn't make any sense to him that someone would be a musician and not be an activist, because that's kind of your job as a musician to do that. And I was thinking about that and just sort of the way that, because like you said, Caitlyn, goth has always sort of accepted queer people and gender bending. But even with like talking about death and morbidity and that kind of thing, for a long time, that was so antithetical and shocking to a broader audience that was enough for goth to be this kind of infamous, like transgressive subculture. And for a long time now, though, there's a lot of, you mentioned the incorporation of goth stuff into more popular culture. Obviously, I think after COVID, the people talking about death became a lot more common. Queer rights and that kind of thing has been a lot more in the public consciousness than it used to be. So I do think it's good in the sense that now you can like have, we talked about this previously, but like you can have piercings and work at a corporate office, or in some places, more places than it used to be, you can go out without being worried about getting jumped or bullied just for looking the way you do. But I think what I'm seeing now with newer goths especially is the embracing more of a, like clubs embracing more of an extreme performance art, or extreme makeup looks, or more far left, more stringent like political views, because I think what people might be trying to do is realizing that like goth of the 80s and 90s is a little more digestible or passé, or like being used by capitalist marketplaces. So we're trying to find new ways to be transgressive instead of being so like just like, oh yeah, goth is this, fun little spooky Halloween thing.
Yeah. Yeah, sure.
The other thing that I want to know, just talking about the whole idea of progressivism and all of that, is the fact that a lot of the sort of goth political ideology comes from a place of social progressivism, not progressivism as a whole. And if you're only looking at things from a two-pole perspective with progressives versus conservatives, then yes, goth aligns with progressives. But if you add additional ideologies into theirs, best example would be libertarians. And there are a lot of goth libertarians, because those are very socially progressive, but fiscally conservative usually, or at least they're more on the pro-capitalism side of things.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So that isn't necessarily directly counterindicated by goth. They will fit into a goth space to some degree. There is the DIY subtext, some of the anti-capitalism stuff, but that's not as major a component of the goth subculture as the social progressivism is. So they're generally accepted. But there's some tension there if things merge, or if things sort of gravitate towards generic progressive political discussions versus just focusing on the goth is gay mantra that Caitlyn espoused.
Yeah. No, I mean, the fact is, like, I just remember when I was a kid, it was very like everyone was very anti-government, just through and through.
Oh, lots of conspiracy theories too.
Yeah.
Fuck the government. Yeah. We're like, fuck the system. Fuck this. Fuck that. And that was like generally what we all thought.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting. I mean, obviously, fuck the government, fuck the system. We all know doesn't work, because they'll just strip us of all of our rights.
Yeah.
If we keep that mentality. It's a very like naive mentality. But I do have a little bit of like adoration for that, for just being like, nah, fuck it all. It's all bullshit. Because I feel that rage inside of me still. Like, I feel like when I see this shit going down and these wars and like this horrible fucking world we're living in, I'm just like, fuck it. I'm just like, I hate all of it. It's so evil. All of it is so fucking evil. And I want to crawl into my cave and listen to my music and never come out.
Yeah.
So there's also that part of me that is just like so overwhelmed by the corruption and evil of the world, and I feel powerless all the time. I feel like I can't do anything about it, and it's sad. It makes me even more fucking sad.
Yeah. I also wanted to do a call back to one of our previous episodes, which dovetails with me, but the Italian goth episode that was talking about some aspect of the dark scene within Italy. And I think this tracks with some other scenes as goth was splitting off from the punk subculture, or as post-punk was splitting off, and then goth split off from that as well. A lot of the rationale behind that was expressed as punk being too rigidly political, too strongly ideological, there were people who liked the music and liked the aesthetic, but didn't want to be going to sit-ins and protests and activist events. And so they gravitated to these other things, this post-punk thing or the goth thing, if they were interested in an aesthetic that was also more dark and macabre. So that definitely was something.
Well, I mean, we have the Black Bloc here. So,
okay.
And they're also in Germany. I actually lived across the street in Berlin from a huge Black Bloc building, and they did their thing like every protest. Like, it's crazy to see. Actually, they're hardcore. They are hardcore. They're squatters. They're anarchy. They fuck shit up. They fuck shit up here in Italy. Like every holiday, they go into the center. They fucking light cars on fire. They smash buildings. Like that's what they do. I mean, they're the real deal. They're not just like online, spouting their shit. Like they are on the streets fucking shit up. Like that's what the Black Bloc does. It's pretty hardcore, actually. I'm like, all right, punk is alive in Europe.
Yeah.
Fucking like that's not for me, but you go.
Yeah. So the sort of a little more directly related to the question of like what is goth, and Kayla, you brought this up earlier, is something I see a lot from especially Gen Z content, is the emphasis on goth as a music-based subculture, and the only thing that it requires to be goth is to enjoy goth music, and anything beyond that is just like a bonus. It's set dressing. It's extra. So I wanted to ask how you feel about that, Kayla. You could, if you want to start.
I started seeing that discourse around like 2016 because I was getting involved in a lot more like goth spaces online. And I feel like when I started seeing that crop up as like the mantra, it made a lot of sense at the time, because obviously, as I'd said before, I didn't realize, even at the point that I was listening to goth music, because that had started a couple years prior, I didn't realize that that was what goth music was,
Yeah.
So I think that specific thing started popping up in response to the fact that like there are a lot of things that we might, as we were saying earlier, we consider to be like goth adjacent, but aren't, technically that, whatever. And it felt necessary to, I think, a lot of older goths at the time, because that's who I was seeing it come from predominantly, because I would say like when I started trying to go to goth events, would have been around like 2017. There were not many. And when I did make it out to one that claimed to be goth, they wouldn't play goth music. And I kept seeing discourse about, depending upon where you were, they're like, oh, like the scene around me has vanished because no one knows what it is anymore. So when I started seeing that phrase like being thrown around all the time, it really made sense. But I think that there is still that idea that like certain artists, as long as they're a little darkly inclined, like Lil Peep, I remember being the hot one of the time, being considered goth just because they're not, I don't know, normal, better way to put it. I lost my train of thought. Anyways, I to me, I think that there are other things that go into being goth, but I am not bothered by the aspiration that goth is a music-based subculture, because I did notice too, in my own experience, a few years back, right before it started to pick up again, that at least around me, at least in Baltimore, there was not really any goth events anymore, because like, once you kind of dissociated the music, that's what happened for a while. It sort of vanished. But at the same time, I do think that in general, there is actually more to it than just listening to music. I just would say that it is probably the most important thing.
Yeah. Caitlin, what do you think?
Yeah, exactly. I completely agree. I mean, it's just like, there's no goth events without goth music. So where are we hanging out? Like, what are we doing? And I think like, obviously, TikTok goths, they have a place to hang out and dress up because it's more visual. But then like, where are you going to do your dances if it wasn't for the goth music? Like, who are you dancing to? You know what I mean? So it is the most important part of it, because it's like gives us all a meaning. where are you going in your goth event and dancing to your goth music, even on TikTok, without, or like, what are you wearing? Like all this goth fashion is around going out and wearing your goth fashion out to a goth event, to a concert, to a club. Like it's the heart of it. But if you want to look at the word goth, it goes, I mean, look at Tim Burton. Do you think he's going to a Twin Tribes concert? No. You know, like he created all of this entire world that we can watch his movies and be like, yes, these are goth films, you know, like to me, you know, and the poetry aspect and the fashion aspect and all of these things that you could call goth and that are linked to the subculture that are so important and give us even more a sense of identity, because we're like, we like these things. We love to go to Renaissance fairs. We love to do all these different things that actually don't really have much to do with the music. You know, they're the other side, and they're also really important. And I think, like, you know, if you don't like horror movies, or maybe you hate Tim Burton movies, but you still love to go to post-punk shows, and you know, are you a goth or not? Well, yeah, of course you are. But it's like, you don't have to embrace all of the things. But, you know, generally, we all kind of like the same stuff, you know? So a lot of us also were really nerdy first, and then we turned into goths. Like, we all kind of liked nerdy things, and then we're like, oh wait, I'm also darkly inclined, and I also like this stuff. So I think it's all valid and it all means something. And you could like even look at it really philosophically and just really get into the philosophical meaning of it and the history of it. And just, you could write book after book after book, probably. You know, but so just saying goth as a music subculture is kind of narrow. And I'm a goth musician, so that is actually, I'm like, yay, me, I'm so important. You know, I would love to just pat myself on the back and be like, you're doing great. But
you are doing great. Pat yourself on the back.
Thank you. I am. I'm doing it currently. But it's so much more than that. And, you know, to me, I think it's good to talk about all the amazing things. Like, how cool would it be to have goth events in your town where it's poetry reading, gothic poetry reading, and we're sitting by candlelight, and we're doing other things. It doesn't just have to be shows and stuff like that. And I remember doing that with my friends. You know, we used to do that. We used to take shrooms and like go into the woods and like do spooky things, and it was fucking amazing. You know, and unfortunately, people stopped getting together, you know, and I think we should encourage more of these types of things. And, you know, a lot of younger people, like, they just don't have hangouts like we used to hang out, because really it was our only option, right? I mean, I remember also, like, we would just like get in a car and drive around, listen to music. Like, even if there wasn't anything to do, we'd just drive around, listening to music, smoking cigarettes.
I did that so many times.
How many times?
What are we gonna do? I don't know. We'll go to McDonald's and then just drive somewhere.
Exactly. We used to like smoke cloves at Denny's. Like that's how old I am. So like order coffee all night long, just like, you know, because that's all there is to do. But I think there's such a beautiful thing about that, and I think we should, you know, I'm starting to be more active on TikTok just by like talking about the subculture, just because I actually care. I'm not doing it for followers. Like, I'm never going to monetize my account. I'm just literally like, I'm like, you know what? I actually care about this stuff, and I care about people coming into the subculture. And if you're curious, like, I'm just going to tell you about my life, and like, I've lived all over the world, and I'm just going to like start talking about what we used to do. And like, maybe it's interesting to people. And And it is, because I think it's just constantly changing so much. Like, wow, things change freaking fast, man.
Yeah.
Mhm.
I think where I settled on it is that, because I do think you have to listen to goth music to be goth. I don't think you can't only listen to goth music to be goth, but I think what music does is puts an emphasis on, or I think what it does is puts an emphasis on pointing to how music facilitates the social and the aesthetic and the history and like existentialism and romanticism and clothing and makeup. It kind of all comes together and is embodied in music. So I always kind of say, like, music isn't just the way something sounds, or even just the way something makes you feel. It's, at least for me, goth music is also dancing and socializing and cemeteries and dressing up and thinking about your emotions and all those kinds of things. And I think kind of what you were getting at, Kayla, as far as the context, is just that before we had this like post-punk explosion of all these bands, there was there wasn't a lot of goth music coming out. And so a lot of people online were doing unboxings and talking about goth as a fashion-based community and whatever. And I think there was kind of a backlash to that, to say that that's not what goth is about. And again, it's kind of this sort of like having a more nuanced view of what that is I think important. Then Caitlyn, before you go, can you share a little about your band and TikTok and where people can find you online?
Yeah, Corlyx, Corlyx. And I mean, because of the name, it's pretty unique. You can just Google it or put it in any search. We're going to come up on Spotify. We have 3 albums out currently, and the 4th one is coming out, and that's actually a double album. So there's 19 songs on that bad boy. So we have like one more single coming out. We're doing a collab with Blue Tangle.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Oh man, that makes my
this is actually the first place I'm yes, this is the first place I'm announcing this.
That's amazing. Wow, I feel honored. I'm a big Blue Tangle fan.
Oh, good. I'm happy. Me and Chris. It was just a great experience. I sent him a song and he loved it. He's like, "Yeah, this is a smashing hit," and I was like, "Oh no."
That's amazing.
So we're really excited about that. I wanted to shoot a music video, but our schedules got really busy this summer. So maybe we'll do a video later. But for now, we're going to be dropping the single. That's coming out late June.
Hell yeah.
So soon. And I actually need to finish up the artwork tonight after this. TikTok as well, Corlyx Official. On my TikTok, I realized like I needed to connect with people more. So it's really the only platform where I'm just like talking to you guys, and I enjoy the little community I've built there. And like Instagram, Facebook, Twitter is more of just like, actually Twitter is like my inner monologue. So if you go on X and like you see what I post, I'm literally just it's like more like my diary.
Mm-hmm.
And then Instagram is more like check out the live photos and check out all the visual stuff. But like TikTok is really the place where I've been just sitting down and like talking. And I really dig it. I'm like I just recently started doing it, so that's cool if you want to hang out on there and check me out on there.
Yeah, for sure. I
Cool.
can endorse all of those things for sure.
Great.
Awesome. Yeah, and thank you so much for spending time with us, hanging out. It was really nice to hang out. I like your stuff, and so it was cool to get to chat for a little bit.
This was great, and I love like the topics, and I think I'll end with this. It's like I care so much about the subculture because it's the place that has always embraced my music the most.
Mm-hmm.
And I only recently started being like, oh, I'm a goth musician, just because before I really felt uncomfortable with the title because I just don't like labels. Most artists don't like labels.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
We have like a very weird thing about that because we're just making art and we're like, whatever you think. And so I kind of stay away from that as long as I could. But then I just kind of got over it. And I was like, you know what? I don't even care anymore. Like, I'm at the point now where I have like almost 60 songs on Spotify. And clearly they are appealing to one demographic only. So I need to just like get over this. And like, I started being more like, yeah, we're doing post-punk and dark wave, but it's also like a lot of 70s rock, those vibes going on. Like there's all kind of different shit in there when you listen. Depends on the song. You can really hear like a lot of different influences. But yeah, I kind of just started being like, all right, it is what it is. And I honestly don't even care anymore. And in the age of like social media marketing and like having to say what you are for people to understand. I got over all of this, like, I don't like labels thing. And now I'm just embracing it and it's all good. Whatever you want to call me, you can call me or you cannot call me. Corlyx is its own little creature. And yeah, so there are people arguing still about is Corlyx goth or not. And
that's what we're talking about when you leave, actually. So it'll be
when I leave, you guys can listen to a couple songs and be like, oh, "That's not goth." But I don't care about this like at all. I totally am just like, you know, I'm an older woman now. I'm just a free bird at this point. So I'm happy.
That's not a goth song. What are you talking about?
Yeah. I'm happy people are just talking about us regardless. So that's cool. And I think the fans that we do have are like really special people. And I just like, I get the cutest messages every day at this point. And I just like, you know, I just love everyone that like understands what we're doing. And yeah, so anyway, but thanks for having me. And Kayla, it was wonderful hearing your perspective as well. You're a smart, wonderful person. I really enjoyed this conversations with all three of you.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, this has been a lot of fun.
Yeah, I was going to ask about lifestyle or the word lifestyle because I have a relationship with that word, and it seems either not something people talk about anymore or just kind of it's less important as a thing. So I wanted to see what your experience with like the idea of a goth lifestyle means and if that's relevant anymore or how you perceive that.
I had a perception of what a quote goth lifestyle was as a teenager because again, like the stuff that I was exposed to when trying to find out more about the subculture really focused on that. But at the same time, that wasn't like strictly defined. When, you know, you would have someone try to explain what they meant by that. It was like I remember there was a quote about like having appreciation for or finding beauty in the dark things like death, for instance. And, you know, surrounding yourself with that kind of thing, like, you know, just like enjoying horror movies or like going for walks in the cemetery and that kind of thing. So I had this idea of almost like a cartoonish idea of what a quote goth lifestyle was for a long time, but I also still kind of was like that. But I will say that like since then I have not heard anyone really say that. Sounds like a wayward comment in a group that gets dogpiled. And even then I haven't seen that in a long time. Yeah, I don't think that there is like this idea of a stringently goth lifestyle anymore. I think it has all been kind of squeezed down into like, you know, quote unquote aesthetic instead.
Right. Yeah.
So, and people kind of use that to mean both like looks, but also like it's kind of taken the place of lifestyle, I think.
Yeah.
But I will also say that the way that I see people using that is that it is described in a way that is almost more of like a performance. Like people have kind of, like I said, traded aesthetic or lifestyle for aesthetic, but it's more so like a what you can put on display than like the whole focus on who you are on the inside thing that I would see when I was younger.
Lifestyle for me is sort of like aestheticizing everything in your life in a certain way, or like mannerisms and behaviors, like you're talking about, like inconspicuously drinking black coffee or scowling at strangers, or the idea, I guess, was presenting yourself in a certain way that reflected your interests and your identity, but it sort of encompassed this like what kind of music you listen to, your fashion, into this sort of like something comprehensively meaningful, this sort of like way of looking at the world in a certain way. And I think you're right that aesthetic is sort of the replacement for that. And I think actually that's kind of a philosophical view of what aesthetic is, because the sort of general use of that word, I think people just sort of think of, well, aesthetic is a fashion thing. But philosophically, it's a much more robust entity than just that. But the problem is, just real quick, the problem I think is that what happens then is if people say, well, goth isn't about an aesthetic, they're talking about the way you dress, but then they're also using it to mean a lot more than that. Like the way you want people to perceive you as a person, beyond just your looks. So it's a little tricky.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think aesthetic is actually starting to be on the out as well, and is being replaced by vibe.
Sure. Yeah.
Which is another all-encompassing thing.
Sorry.
Go on.
I thought a vibe is being part of aesthetic, like the thing that makes it an aesthetic rather than just like an appearance or a look, is that it's the look mixed with the vibe, you know?
I think that might be why it's, at least to me, seeming to be replacing aesthetics, because aesthetic is so correlated with a visual thing. It's a whole, what you see is the aesthetic, which, like Danny was saying, is not entirely true. It is oftentimes understood as larger, but I think people are moving away from it because it has that sort of connotation, and vibe is a little bit more generic and could be more all-encompassing. But that's just, I hear people talking about vibe more than I hear them talking about aesthetic these days. Not that I am up with the kids, but what I do see, vibe is definitely taking the place where I used to see aesthetic be the buzzword for all of that before, like 5 years ago.
So kind of the other part of it, because for me, part of what lifestyle was how you thought about the world. Like kind of what I said, like the lens through which you view things. And we kind of brought this up in the 2000s episode, but the relationship between goth and the mainstream. And we've sort of taught, or, you know, however you want to define mainstream, but we sort of talked around that popularization of goth. And so without sort of sharing my experience, I'm curious what you view the relationship between goth and mainstream culture is.
I don't know what the relationship between goth and mainstream culture is, because I feel like I don't engage enough with mainstream culture to have a really solid idea. I'm not going to lie. I do think that because of the way that every group gets to interact with one another on the internet, I do think that there is a somewhat better understanding of goth now amongst like the average person, but I don't know if I could really speak to like how it's viewed in mainstream culture.
So I guess what I'm kind of getting at it then is when I was younger, a lot of people kind of almost revolve their identity around like an animosity of mainstream culture, whether like pop culture, pop music, mainstream fashion trends, celebrities, and there's this very sort of like goth is the opposite of whatever the mainstream is, whether it's because we were experienced a lot of bullying or whatever. There is this relationship of we don't like that, we don't want that, we're going to make fun of it, it's all trash kind of thing. Is that still, or is it just because, like you were saying, the internet is so interconnected that the idea of what mainstream is isn't really even relevant anymore?
I don't know if to say that like the idea of what mainstream is isn't relevant anymore, because occasionally I see some, like animosity amongst alt people and I guess non-alt people, for lack of a better way to say that. But for the most part, I think that it's largely integrated. Again, like what I've seen with like, in the classroom, for instance, like I said, a lot of these kids kind of go through sudden phases, and it seems to be a lot more kids being like that than it was certainly when I was in school. So I do think that there's less of an attitude for it, because even if like, a kid doesn't really like a certain aesthetic or subculture or whatever, they're not as inclined to be mean about it. I've found it seems like everyone gets along more, based on what I've seen. That's
interesting. Yeah, I did want to ask about that too, because I know, thinking about other subcultures and our interactions with them, there was stuff with like e-girls or visco girls or whatever. Do you think that subcultures are generally more copacetic, like friendly with each other and kind of interact in a more friendly way? Because like when I was younger, there was beefs between metal kids and the emo kids and the goth kids and the jocks and whatever. Do you think that's less of a thing now?
Oh, I think that's definitely less of a thing. I mean, by the time even I was in high school, that was a lot less of a thing. We had like, like my friend group, for instance, consisted of me being like, I don't know, like trad goth, for lack of a better way to put it. But then like half of our friends were still emo, another chunk were really just into cosplay and nerdy stuff. Like some of them just really liked metal. Like, we had a whole diversity of it there. And I think that we stuck together at that point because like we were the, weird kids. At this point in time, I see a lot of sticking together amongst I guess the weird kids. Yeah, there doesn't seem to be much animosity amongst the subcultures. I do also think that might have something to do with where you live. Like me growing up, I lived in a not rural, but like more rural area than the city I'm in now. And so I think it made sense because there was just like less available to me at the time for people to stick together like that. I think that most of the time, because like people trade off aesthetics pretty quickly, it also makes sense for people to make a bunch of friends and that are interested in other things that also have, some level of similarity.
Yeah, I think there definitely is a correlation with the population of the area you're with, because it's a lot easier to be, oh, I only want to hang out with other goths, when there are dozens of them in your area that you can go and hang out with. But when you're the only one, and then this other person over here is the only punk, and this other person is the only raver and the only theater kid and the only band geek, you will gravitate together because I mean, we as human beings, we are social and we like to congregate in groups because that is what we feel comfortable and feel safety when we're forced to be out in public. It's a lot harder to be out in public alone when something about you is marking you as outside of whatever the mainstream is, which in my mind, I guess to me, the mainstream is just those appearances, acts, behaviors that don't really cause anyone to bat an eye. If you say you like this, or if you look a certain way and nobody really looks at you twice or questions it, that's kind of what the mainstream is. It's this quote unquote, it's been so normalized that nobody really cares. And everything that diverges from that is where, well, one, people get interesting, but to where tension potentially occurs.
I guess there has to be some level of tension too, because I'm thinking about it, and like amongst students, like interacting with one another, they are that way. But when I've worked at high schools, which I hate doing, those kids, they act a little different. They're also like the last of the Zoomers right now. Like starting, I think next school year, the freshmen are going to be Gen Alpha. So like their behavioral patterns are a little bit different. Like I know that some of those kids, like I had a kid try to bully me because they would, since I'm like a younger teacher, they would see me as a peer, and he just kept calling me emo. I have seen some degree of that. The just yelling emo or like barking. I don't know what's up with the barking. That one, I've never understood that one.
I don't know where that comes from. I get a lot of the emo stuff from the kids in grade school though. And even at Target the other day, they were, I don't know, maybe they were 15, 16-ish, 4 or 5 kids while my wife and I were putting our groceries away, kind of came by and were making some comments like, oh, I hate emos and blah, blah. I'm like, what? Who? What? Am I in high school again? What's happening? These kids are trying to bully me? What's going on here? It's weird. Let's maybe end on something more specific to the premise of the show, which I guess is generational stuff. This is always its own kind of echo chamber, but there's a lot of content online about, I guess you could say in mainstream culture, about like finding differences between Gen Z and millennials, and like, oh, this, the fashion thing or the some behavioral thing. Is that sort of discourse around generational differences relevant at all to your goth experience, or is it just sort of like a thing people argue about online?
It's kind of hard to say. I have made friends with people who are older than me, for sure, in the scene, but I do notice that there is kind of a disconnect in terms of like, I don't know, just even like our social conventions, things that we think are funny or cool are just like obviously we fundamentally agree on certain like tastes and things, but I do think that there is kind of like a fundamental disconnect in a lot of ways amongst the generations, and I think that it's not inherently bad at all, though, is the thing. A lot of the discourse around it right now is quite literally just that, like, each generation thinks that the other's behavior is cringe. Like, there's not a lot more to it than that. So I don't think it carries over much into real life, short of like if someone has a behavior or like does something that like kind of bothers you, you just don't talk to them again.
Right.
But I mean, at least around Baltimore, like the goth nights that I go to, Bats Over Baltimore just ended, and that usually pulled in a slightly older crowd because it was the one that was around forever. But and also that's a 21 plus night, right. So it inherently brought in an older crowd. But I find a bigger mix at the Black Celebration nights that happen every month, and those seem to bring in a pretty mixed crowd. And it's a combination of, there's like cliques there for sure. There's like people I see with the same like 2 to 3 people every time, and it's within their respective age groups. But there's also plenty of people that just kind of interact throughout all the generations. I mean, boomer to zoomer. Yeah. So like, I think that it doesn't affect real life too much, aside from like, again, like there are certain behaviors that people do that you would kind of associate with a generation
like
thing that
jokes.
Like maybe maybe, I don't know.
That's so millennial.
Yeah, I mean, like, so, yeah, some of the like phrasings and stuff that people use, even that people think is cool, like that kind of thing, that might off-put some people, but it doesn't seem to be that much of like a barrier that it's causing any problems, at least not in my experience.
I hate them, like, and that's fine because people like you grow up with different experiences with language, and like that just varies even between people and families and places. I find it cringe when you have millennials that are trying to do like AAVE or like that kind of thing to seem hip. That I think is really cringe. And the other thing that bothers me is just like the millennials who make it their personality about how offended they are that a 20-year-old thinks side parts are gross or skinny jeans are dumb or whatever. That is really stupid. Like how there's people I see complaining about that online. But actually, since you brought up the club, that made me think about if you notice a difference in how generations engage with a club environment, because I've heard a few different things about that.
Yeah, I would say that people my age and younger do tend to like stick to themselves initially, or like they don't do a lot of dancing initially. It kind of depends upon how much younger they are than me, because also though, if they're old enough to drink and then they drink, they will loosen up and start talking to people and dancing, and there's not that much of a huge difference. I just think that like the initial behavior is that like, you know, if you're older, you've been to the goth club before many times, and also throughout points in time where like the internet wasn't around and you just had to like interact like a normal person. Whereas, you know, this is like the starting point for a lot of younger people. So they've only grown up in an era where that is how it is, you know?
Yeah, I was thinking specifically, I've seen some people, I guess they're talking about this in reference to mainstream clubs or whatever, popular clubs, where some people have said that like Gen Z are more hesitant to dance and relax and kind of let go because they're constantly worried or aware of being filmed and maybe having that clipped onto Instagram or Twitter or something, and have like people making fun of them because like older people didn't grow up having to worry about everything they did being recorded and then potentially posted somewhere to be analyzed by thousands of people or whatever. So I don't know if you see that kind of hesitancy, or if that's just a different setting in a goth club maybe.
I think there's two things about that. Is that one, like I said, I do kind of see that hesitancy at first until they start drinking. A lot of that hesitancy goes out the window then. Okay. But the other thing about it, though, is that because, at least, again, in the clubs, the goth nights that are around me, it is such a mixed bag of ages that, like, they will start dancing if there are others dancing already.
Right.
So,
okay.
Again, with a lot of older people who don't have that care, concern, they'll just start doing it. So then the younger people who did have that care and concern, like, they'll get up there too. But it's true that like I don't usually see someone my age or younger start it unless they're like a regular. You know?
Actually, that's interesting too, because I don't think my experience with goth clubs and events has always been, it might skew one way or the other a little more, but it's usually pretty mixed age wise. And I would guess that non-goth subcultures and clubs would have a much harder line of like the age of people that are there.
Yeah.
There is, at least all the ones I've been to, which isn't a ton, but I've been to a fair amount of I guess regular club nights, whether they were electronic nights or R&B hip hoppy flavored nights, whatever's popular at the time. And there is definitely, I feel a little bit more awkward at those locations just because I am far and away the oldest person there, almost always. It's rarely that I see many people outside of the 20s that are in those sort of regular popular clubs, at least at the level I'm at. Now, I'm not going to the velvet rope, got to be on the special list to enter, get kicked out by the bouncer kind of clubs. I think those tend to have maybe a little wider age range because that's more about social cachet than about what the other clubs are, which are more about you're young, you're trying to meet people and finding a way to move on to the next stage in life. So it's more more of a meat market kind of idea.
Yeah.
Whereas the goth club, as it's been portrayed, is, yes, people do use it to meet people. That's always going to be a social outlet. But even once you've met people, you've got couples who go together regularly. It's not like, oh, I met someone, I'm in a steady relationship, we don't go out anymore because I'm past that. In a goth club, you do go out together. Families go out. So, you know, if you're a lifer in the subculture, you do, life permitting, continue going out to the club because it is such a key part of sort of the social fabric of the subculture, that you want to continue being in that, and it isn't just a means to an end like I find a lot of, or it feels a lot of other clubs focus on. So we definitely have a much wider range of ages, and I don't feel like such an old man creep at a goth club. Especially some of like the nights that are celebrating either at an older club or are celebrating, like we have a neo reunion from an old club that used to be here. Whenever I go to that, it's once a year at our main goth club. The vast majority of people at that club, I feel, are Gen X or Boomer, with a lot less people who are below Gen X, whereas the regular Nocturna Club night is, you know, the bell curve has probably millennial is at the peak of the bell curve, Gen X being a little bit above that, and then the Zoomer/Boomer are at the tail ends of the bells. They're definitely people of all the generations, all four of those generations at least, represented. But that's kind of how I feel the bell curve exists in there, whereas the Gen X/Boomer boundary is more the bell curve at the reunion for the older 80s club that they're celebrating. So that's definitely a demographic variance. Looking at, I guess, my very vague impression is I feel that the younger club goers are less likely to attend the club solo than I feel people of my generation are. I mean, I look at myself and I'm probably even outside of my own generation. I will go to events alone the vast majority of the time and not even know anybody at the event. And I will still go just because I like being immersed in the atmosphere. I don't necessarily need to gather together with a friend group. And even sometimes when I do know friends, depending on how close I am with them, it may be we say hi, we chat for a bit, and then we go our separate ways and may not really interact much for the rest of the club night. I mean, if I'm with close friends, I'll usually just hang out with them the whole night. But for a lot of the more casual acquaintances, it's like, oh, hey, how you doing? It's good to see you out. Have a good night. And then we go our separate ways. And that's always been how I attend clubs. I don't see many people in the Zoomer. Definitely, I almost never see solo Zoomers. Some millennials is a little bit mixed, although I can't say for sure because it's not like we all have little signs over our heads that tell us what the age is and what generation we're in. So I'm basing it almost exclusively on other external markers, whether it is just looking young or if it's just sort of social cues. They act a certain way, but I can't really, it's not like I could define, oh, if they act this way, then they're a millennial. If they act this way, they're a Zoomer. It's just, you get this vibe as, you know, this is, maybe they're that generation. So that's the one thing I've really noticed is that the younger generations tend to go in groups and also tend to dance more in groups. There's less of the dancing together alone thing that I was used to in the 90s and definitely was the norm. Is everybody kind of stakes out their own space and they're in their own little world, existing for their experience of the music, and sometimes not even trying to acknowledge other people on the dance floor. And you get people who bump into each other and accidentally smack one another or spike somebody with their jewelry.
Dump their beer on my hair. That's happened a few times. Yeah. And usually that's considered just, at least for my generation, what I was used to, that was just par for the course. That's just, you experience it. It happens. If you're a good person on the floor, you pause, you acknowledge the other person, say, oh yeah, I
Sorry, I stepped on your foot. I hit you. I bumped into you. Are you okay? We good? And then you just go back to doing your thing and try to maybe be a little bit more cognizant of the area around you, but there's still not really a direct engagement. Whereas a lot of the younger people seem to want to be, they're not doing the I guess, the normal club circle dancing as much, but that's a little bit more prevalent. But they're at least, they usually have a friend. They're dancing together and chatting on the dance floor rather than being absorbed in this private experience of communing with music through dance.
Yeah. That's interesting. I have not ever gone to, no, that's not true. I did go to the club alone once, but it was like I decided to go after a friend bailed on me.
Right, yeah.
And I don't dance alone. I never even considered doing that. I'm not gonna lie.
Yeah. I will also acknowledge that me going to clubs alone, huge male privilege. Yeah. So there's that as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, it definitely depends upon where you are with that too. Because like I wouldn't have gone to the depot alone because of the area, but I go to the auto bar alone, you know. So I.
Yeah, I always try and find somebody to walk with me. It's because usually when I go out, I'm much more femme presenting, and I always feel uncomfortable walking through Chicago. But that's just anyway. Kayla, do you want to share any social media links or anything, any projects or anything for people to check out?
Yeah, sure. I'm Kayla/Nemo/Soupy, depending upon where you're at. Most of my ats on most things like YouTube, Instagram, I guess TikTok too, but I don't really use it much anymore, is Soupy and the Bad Cheese, all one word. Yeah. And I also front a feminist punk band called Scum.
Hell yeah.
Which I only really use the Instagram for that, but we have stuff on Spotify too. There's a link tree on the Instagram though. That's Scum_band official, I think. That's really all. That's all I do.
Nice.
Fantastic. Yeah, everybody should go check that out. And it was funny that even just there, I realized I said social media and you said my ats. So there you go. Language difference.
Yeah.
And as I said earlier, but yeah, thanks for hanging out. This was really lovely. I really enjoyed hearing your perspective on everything.
Thanks for having me. This was a lot of fun.
Before I wrap up, I wanted to mention a couple episodes that are related to this discussion today, in case you're interested. If you want to listen to more about philosophical aesthetic, we explored that with a friend of mine around her PhD thesis on our episode that was called What We Learned from the World's Largest Goth Survey. And we've had a few episodes in the past about generational differences as well. So recently there was the TikTok and the Modern Goth episode. Episode 106 was titled Aging in Goth, which was more focused on, obviously, the Gen X and Boomer experience of Goth. And I'd also like to give a mention to Soph, who was supposed to be on this episode. They're a promoter and DJ in England, and unfortunately there was a last-minute scheduling conflict that prevented them from being on. But we'll try and get her on a future episode because I would really love to hear some of her thoughts on this. You know, sort of thinking about the very end of this episode, I guess we can move into some post-show musings territory here. The concept of cringe, I think, is interesting. I actually, a few days ago, before we recorded, ran into a video by Dr. Moeller about cringe. And I can share some of those insights as well. I'll put a link to the video in the show notes. But it's sort of built off of the concepts of shame, embarrassment, and guilt in a lot of ways. Guilt is part of an authenticity-based identity framework. It's the blaming of the original self, quote-unquote original, the feeling that one's inner self is worthless, that the self is an imposter in some way. And this drives the desire to repent or make amends with the self to rid the feeling of living a lie. Cringe, though, is more social based. It's either a blame that comes from other peers or a perceived shame that's based in second order observation. Second order observation is our perception or idea about how others think about us. Rather than looking at ourselves in a mirror, we're looking at ourselves through the eyes and judgments of a third-party peer. We aren't blaming a fundamental essence in ourselves, but blaming the identity we've curated in order to present to other people. It's this idea of profile curation, like you would, talk about a LinkedIn or an Instagram or whatever. We have this construction of ourselves that we present to others, and then we judge that construction through the perspective of other people. And then another element of cringe, Moeller argues, is that it implies the person who's cringe doesn't know they're cringe. They're oblivious to being shamed by others. In a lot of ways, cringe is endemic of the internet. It's a bit like watching Jerry Springer, because you get some glee or some anxiety relief by seeing another's misery. You can take refuge in the fact that it's someone else, not you, who's embarrassing. Maybe your life sucks, but at least you don't do whatever that was. This is why some people say cringe culture is dead, because they're pushing for an authenticity-based identity. If you're being true to yourself and are having fun, then you can't be cringe because you aren't doing the thing to impress or ingratiate yourself to a group. You're just being yourself. I see a lot of those kinds of posts online now, sort of people saying, I embrace my cringe because it's who I am. Right. And when you're proud of something, it immunizes you from cringe because you're doing it intentionally, not unintentionally. So cringe is sort of this product of judging ourselves through the eyes of others, which creates this need for constant validation. We see this on Instagram posts where we worry about how many likes we get per photo and worry about what the comments are saying. We need that validation from our general peer. Are we goth enough? Is our makeup good enough? Etc. and so on. And it's all contextual and variable, of course. Furries were cringe when I was younger, but my son's group of friends think that furries are cool now. And then there's the Therians, which are getting more exposure recently. Those are the people who think they can shapeshift into animals. And so now that's cringe. And I think this is important just to qualify our discussion, and in relation to our discussion of generations as well. It's important because we as individuals and as collectives are heterogeneous. We're dynamic. We exist in relation to the organisms and histories and expectations and objects around us. So no one specific behavior is always cringe. And when we talk about Gen Z or we talk about millennials and we say millennials do this, Gen Z does that. These are, of course, gross abstractions rather than axial truths or immutable constants, right? Even out of the field of philosophy, a lot of scientific data would show that these general perceptions of generations, like Gen Z is lazier or whatever. When you compare information between generations, you find that there's actually, broadly speaking, more similarities than there are differences. And then, of course, beyond that, as you narrow down to any given community or location, those similarities and differences are a lot less consistent than we might like to label them. So yeah, and I guess, with cringe, thinking about the sort of immunizing yourself against cringe, I see a lot of people in their 40s talking about how they've evolved past cringe because it's a waste of time and energy trying to change your personality to please others rather than please yourself. And so again, there's that sort of tension between an authenticity-based identity formation, which assumes this sort of immutable self, this sort of core essence, and this profile identity curation. And I don't think these are used mutually exclusively. I think a lot of us think about ourselves and others with a mixture of these different types of identity frameworks. Now, if you listen to the show, you know that I go in for a kind of actor network theory approach to identity and ontology, rather than seeing the self as some contiguous, cohesive entity that persists across time, or rather than relying on kind of stringent, static taxonomies. I go in for this sort of web-like approach, looking at the interactions between clusters of actors. But I'm not going to get into that right now. We've talked about that at length on other episodes. If you want a recommendation, there's the enacting goth episode. There's the from sound to subculture episode. But I do think there's more here to think over and talk about in future episodes. And this is definitely a topic I think we will revisit, both around identity and generational differences and experiences. I think this was a very good discussion, but there's a lot more juice to be squeezed out of this. And I think on future episodes, we're going to be discussing that. Speaking of future episodes, our next episode will revolve around Middle Eastern goth, which is nice. We sort of, I think, inadvertently ended up with a focus on non-American experiences of goth this year, which there were years in the past where that was a focus of sort of this goth around the world kind of thing. And that was on purpose. This was just sort of a nice happenstance. So that'll be good. We'll have a friend of mine coming on from Lebanon, and there will be at least one other guest. And so we'll be talking around these ideas, sort of like with our Desi Goth episode earlier this year. We'll probably talk about Palestine and those kinds of things. Forgive my allergies. It's the season. So I'm sorry if my voice is kind of stuffed up. But with that, I'd like to thank all of you for your time and your support, and encourage anyone who enjoys this show to take a look at our Patreon page, patreon.com/cemetery confessions. You can jump on for just $1 if you want to get access to the Discord, or just to provide support for the podcast. Though every single person from $1 up who is on the Patreon makes this show possible. And so that support really means a lot. You might think like, well, look, it's $1 a month. That's not even whatever you want to compare it to. That's not even a coffee, or that's not even a candy bar or whatever. But that $1 a month in a community setting is significant. And so I really appreciate all of that support. Of course, there's other stuff on the Patreon, exclusive content and merchandise and whatever, all this stuff. So if you're interested in that, you can check it out. But I just wanted to, as always, thank everyone who supports us financially, because that keeps this show going. And to close out the episode, I'm going to play one of the newer singles from Corlyx called The Sacrifice. I hope you enjoy that. And until next time, stay dark.
The soul keeps me awake. find no resting place, has been disturbed by dread. She rises up instead. A hand breaks through the grave. A hand breaks through the grave. The whisper down my neck, the blood drips from the moon. A night for the undead. She's calling out to you. Get ready for the sacrifice. Come dance with us as we cast spells in the night. Get ready for the sacrifice. Come dance with us as we cast spells in the night. Get ready for the sacrifice. The wind blows through the trees. She's calling out to me. The earth gives me the strength to honor her remains. A hand breaks through the grave. The whisper down my neck, the blood drips from the moon. A night for the undead. She's calling out to you. Get ready for the sacrifice. Come dance with us as we cast spells in the night. Get ready for the sacrifice. Come dance with us as we cast spells in the night. Get ready for the sacrifice. Get ready for the sacrifice. Come dance with us as we cast spells in the night. Get ready for the sacrifice. Come dance with us as we cast spells in the night.
The preceding program is a member of The Belfry, a network of blogs, podcasts, and videos for the darkly inclined. Go to thebelfry.rip for more information.